a threat to the political establishment. He received massive support across the country and then started the People Power movement in 2017 to encourage young Ugandans to get involved in politics. Since then, he's been arrested, tortured, subjected to various other forms of abuse and harassment. His supporters and friends have been targeted by the government, with some killed and others abducted and tortured. Bobi Wine was a presidential candidate in Uganda's most recent election, which has been described as the most violent and least fair in the country's history. He was placed under house arrest, denied access to food or water. Now, I see that on social media there's tremendous excitement that you're here at the United Nations and that your followers refer to you as Mr. President. You have the floor.
On the 18th of February, the world's eyes turned to Geneva as Bobi Wine prepared to address the international community about the 2026 election in Uganda. Supporters expected Bobi Wine to highlight the struggles he faced, the challenges of campaigning under intimidation, and the ways in which ordinary Ugandans were denied their political rights. Bobi Wine would likely describe how his campaign rallies were blocked and convoys stopped, with supporters arrested simply for showing up. He would emphasize the constant presence of security forces, the tear gas fired into peaceful gatherings, and the fear that spread through communities whenever he or his team tried to campaign. Bobi Wine would remind the world that these were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic effort to prevent opposition voices from reaching voters. Supporters expected Bobi Wine to discuss the nationwide internet shutdown that occurred during the voting period. He would likely argue that cutting off communication left millions of Ugandans in isolation, unable to share information about polling stations, and prevented real-time monitoring of the election. Bobi Wine would probably frame this as a deliberate tactic to suppress transparency and limit citizens' ability to defend their votes. Bobi Wine would also address the period of house confinement that followed the election. He would describe how security forces surrounded his home, restricting his movements, and how hundreds of his supporters were arrested for simply standing with him. Bobi Wine would argue that this was not just an attack on him personally, but an attack on every Ugandan's right to assemble, to vote freely, and to participate in politics without fear. Supporters expected Bobi Wine to challenge the official results, declaring Yoweri Museveni the winner. He would likely highlight the irregularities at polling stations, the opaque counting processes, and the exclusion of opposition agents from observing votes. Bobi Wine would suggest that millions of votes were disregarded, and that the announced results reflected a stolen mandate rather than the true will of the people. Bobi Wine would probably draw attention to the human cost of these events. Families would have lived in fear. Young people who hoped for change would have been discouraged, and communities that tried to mobilize peacefully would have faced harassment. He would portray the Museveni government as relying on military power to suppress dissent, limit media freedom, and close political space. In Bobi Wine's narrative, the election would appear less as a democratic process and more as a tool of dictatorship. Despite these challenges, Bobi Wine would likely stress resilience and hope. He would encourage Ugandans to continue demanding accountability, to fight for their rights, and to aspire for a country where elections genuinely reflected the people's will. Bobi Wine would remind his supporters that the struggle was not only about winning one election, but about ensuring freedom, dignity, and meaningful participation for all citizens. His commentary would likely highlight that the international community needed to see the reality of Uganda, but that ultimate change must come from the Ugandan people themselves. Bobi Wine would want the world to understand that even in the face of repression, the spirit of the people remained unbroken, and the fight for democracy would continue. While the microphone was in Geneva, Bobi Wine's message would resonate back home in Uganda. Supporters would expect him to remind everyone that the people would not be silenced, that their rights mattered, and that the struggle for freedom and dignity was far from over.